Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 21st Annual Las Vegas Book Festival. My name is Tony Sanchez, and I am the Executive Vice President of Business Development and External Relations for NV Energy. And NV Energy is a proud sponsor of today's book festival. We hope you enjoyed today, and I think we're really in for a treat this evening. I'd like to welcome each of you to our headlining event with author, journalist, and icon Carl Bernstein. Anyone interested in politics and history knows Mr. Bernstein, who in 1972, while a reporter for the Washington Post, teamed up with Bob Woodward to report on the infamous Watergate scandal. Together, Bernstein and Woodward reporting is often called the single greatest reporting effort of all time, given that it revealed significant scandal within the White House, resulting in the resignation of then President Richard Nixon. His most recent book is Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom, and it is a memoir of his early years in journalism. Who better to moderate this discussion today than Las Vegas's own newsroom man, Las Vegas Review-Journal government and politics editor, Steve Sebelius. A journalist for more than 30 years, Steve has worked for daily and weekly newspapers in California and Nevada. During his career, he's covered local government, education, energy, courts, special projects, and of course, politics. The book festival is produced by the City of Las Vegas, the Mayor's Fund, NV Energy, and Nevada Humanities. Our media sponsors are the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Audacity Radio, and the CW. And now, please join me, and I'm pleased to introduce Steve Sebelius to the podium.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you to the city and all the staffers who work year-round to bring the book festival to fruition every year. So it's a great event. As those of you who've been here all day, there's been some great panels, and I know this one is going to be a really great panel as well. As Tony said, Carl Bernstein is co-author of All the President's Men and The Final Days. These are books about the fall of Richard Nixon. They won the Pulitzer Prize for public service for their reporting on Watergate, and inspired an entire generation of young people to pursue journalism and investigative journalism as a career. In his life, Carl has also written biographies of Pope John Paul II and Hillary Clinton, and currently is a CNN political analyst and contributor to the magazine Vanity Fair. But today we're going to be talking about his latest book, Chasing History, which is about an earlier period in his life. It's subtitled A Kid in the Newsroom, and I related to a lot of the passages since I too was once a kid in the newsroom. Although I didn't start as young as Mr. Bernstein did at the Washington Star. Any of you who read the book, and there will be a signing in the auditorium right here after the event today, will immediately notice some of the Las Vegas connections right from the very start. When he was growing up in Washington, he was neighbors with a senator by the name of Alan Bible, who some of you may recognize, Nevada senator for whom the Bible Federal Building is named. One of Alan Bible's sons, Bill Bible, was a prominent figure in Nevada politics and government. Was the budget director for the state, and was also on the gaming commission. So there's Nevada connections right from the start. I'll let him tell you how much he paid for a hotel room in his first visit to Las Vegas, and how old he was while drinking the complimentary martinis. We'll get to that. But I want to start you started at a very young age. You were a teenager when you started in journalism and first saw the newsroom, the chaotic newsroom of the Washington Star. And there was a theme that runs, I think, throughout the book, which is a theme about paying your dues. People don't start as investigative reporters. They don't start on high-profile beats. They start by paying your dues, and you certainly paid your dues first as a copy boy, and then working your way up to doing reporting, going out with the police reporters, getting to know the city, even though you'd grown up in the city, getting to know the city in a whole new way on that, and learning from watching the pros. Talk a little bit about that paying your dues.
Sure. Can I ask a favor? Is it okay we could keep the lights on the audience a little bit? And
Sure,
so,
yeah,
so
a couple of house lights.
between us, so we can be a little more intimate. Is that,
There we go. There we go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Well, first of all, I don't want to elevate what you've said too much, because part of my luck was getting this job at age 16, which probably kept me out of juvenile detention center. I was a terrible student in high school, and it says in the book, I had 1 foot in the pool hall, 1 foot in the juvenile court, and maybe a toe in the classroom. And so I had a 10th grade journalism course, and I could pass some exams by writing essays, and that was about it. And my father sort of sensed that I might not make it out of high school, but he had a friend who worked at the afternoon newspaper in town and got me an interview for a job. And I'd taken typing in the 10th grade with the girls. I was sick of shop classes, building all these meaningless things out of wood that had toothpick holders in them and all this. And so I went for an interview at this great newspaper, which was the afternoon paper in Washington, and I didn't get hired. I think the guy who was a member of the owning family of the paper thought I was probably too short and too young looking to be hired. And I kept knocking on the door to go back. And the reason was, when he left after this interview, and you're going to discover, as my wife says, I can really be circumlocucious. I'll try after this first answer to condense things a little bit. But to set the scene, after the interview, he took me out through a back door of his office into the newsroom. And there was this amazing commotion going on. Like everybody running and yelling as if they were on the most urgent errands in the nation. And he led me up the middle aisle of the newsroom. People were hollering copy, and then a copy boy, which is the lowest level position in a newsroom. Copy boys did everything. They were office boys. They ran pieces of copy between the desks, and a copy boy came up with a dolly full of newspapers that just had come off the presses. And the guy handed me one. It was still warm. And I knew in that moment that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And so I kept knocking on this guy's door. And finally he said, "Can you type?" I said, "Yeah, I can type." He said, "Well, okay, go take the typing test and go see the nurse for the company and see how you do." He called, and I got a call the next day saying, "Come to work, you're hired." And it was because I could type so fast. Because I'd taken that class with the girls. And so immediately I was immersed in this enterprise, capital of the United States, where I grew up. My mother's a native of Washington too. Kennedy is running against Nixon for president. It's the beginning of the real push for civil rights in this country. And within 2 weeks, I'd become kind of friends with the state editor, the Maryland, Virginia editor of the paper, because he lived around the corner from me. It's amazing how proximity, I think this is true of life, proximity means a lot. And if you're lucky, you get a chance because of proximity, but it's what you do with that proximity or what crosses your eyes. And so this state editor lived around the corner. My next door neighbor was Alan Bible, the senator from Nevada and who became a wonderful source for me at the age of 17. And so the state editor said to me, you know, Kennedy's coming to your high school tomorrow. Why don't you go out with a notebook and just take notes on the crowd, because you know the terrain there. And our political reporter is a fancy national political reporter. He's great on the politics, but he doesn't know the terrain. And so I did. And lo and behold, the next day's story with Kennedy coming to my high school, and it's described in the book. About half the story was from my notes. A couple of weeks later, the head copy boy said, Bernstein, take a cab out to Burning Tree Country Club in Maryland. Ike is out there playing golf. This was in the last few weeks of Eisenhower's presidency. This will tell you how old I am right now, too. 78, if you want to know. And bring back some pictures that the photographer has taken. So we were an afternoon paper, you know, so deadline, get the pictures in the paper. So I had this yellow identification card, which was like, it was like a magic entry. It was like open sesame. You know, if you flash this card at somebody and you say, Carl Bernstein, Evening Star. Amazing, you must know this. I mean, it's a scamp's greatest tool. And so I go out to Burning Tree. Right. I go out to Burning Tree and go like that. And suddenly I'm with the head caddy and he takes me out. And there's a putting green. And I thought Ike was out on a golf course somewhere. No, Ike is there sinking putts. And I'm like 10 feet from him. One Secret Service guy, and I can see the brown spots on the hands of the President of the United States. And that was the beginning. And so every day I was exposed to everything that was going on. I would go into the wire room, 20 machines, teletype machines, where news from around the world, from the state, from the United States, all over the world would come in, you know, and look at it, take it to whatever desk it was supposed to go to. Then I started going to Kennedy's press conferences to dictate a text back to, not to report, but to dictate a text word for word. We got mimeographed, almost simultaneous accounts of what he was saying, and I would dictate a text back to the newsroom. But there I was, this kid in the newsroom, doing this with the greatest reporters in the world all around me, from all over the world, and watching Jack Kennedy in his press conferences. And it just went on, and very quickly, people there could see I had some facility for this. And you'll read in the book, I also had some facility for mischief. I also had some facility for being a little too audacious sometimes. There's a story in there where I touched a piece of type in the composing room, where the individual pages would be made from molten lead, would spit out these little pieces of type. And there were, 200 printers there that would make these pages up. And one day I thought I was real smart, because you had to know how to read upside down to be a printer. Upside down and backwards. And I taught myself how to do it. So one day I'm up there, and I put my finger on a piece of type, and I said to the foreman of this huge composing room, I said, that headline, is wrong. The spelling of airplane is wrong. All of a sudden, this guy takes his arm, goes like this, it's about this size, the size of a newspaper page, knocks all of these thousands of pieces of type onto the floor, and the city editor is there watching this. And what I didn't know till later, meanwhile the paper was held up for a whole edition. It didn't cost him but about $20,000, which in that day was a lot of money, that only members of the International Topographical Union could touch a piece of type. Learned my lesson. But the city editor said to me, he said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I want to be a newspaper. He said, why? I said, well, I'm excited about what's going on here, and I've always been interested in secrets. And he said, well, promise me one thing. He said, you don't want to be a printer, right? I said, no. He promised me one thing. I said, what's that? He says, you'll never touch another piece of type as long as you live. I said, fine. He pulled out this long roll of paper, type paper. It's from one of the teletype machines. And it had all of the assignments where reporters were going to be watching Kennedy's inaugural parade from. He said, you go to 4th Street right there. And that was the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you dwell on, you said you weren't that great of a student, was your inconstant attendance.
It's understates.
At university, and there was a push at the time to professionalize or ensure that reporters had college degrees, and you didn't have a college degree, and that got in your way of being hired full time at the Star. Your career turned out all right without that degree, wouldn't you say? Do you think a degree is necessary to be a good reporter?
No. And let me tell you, I think we need a lot more dropouts in newspapers and news organizations. I'm really serious. But let's talk about for a second what happened. It was right at the era when newspapers stopped hiring people without a college degree. And I think, a lot of those reporters who've been veterans of World War II, some of them did not have a college degree, some of them did. And so they made me a reporter in the summers, and basically what I was doing by the time I was 18 was mostly reporting. And by the time I got thrown out of school or University of Maryland, dropped out and all the rest, there was a time when they were making some new hires, and this great city editor said, well, put Bernstein there. The managing editor said, oh, no, can't do that, gotta have a college degree. And he came to me, this managing editor, said, Carl, you really put your shoulder to the wheel, but the training program for reporters, there's no substitute for that. Meanwhile, I had done everything, And so by the time I was 21, they still wanted me to have a degree, so I left. But I'm really serious about it. One of the problems in the news business, and conservatives have been much better than liberals about this, is newsrooms were not and still not are representative enough of our communities and the country, politically, socially, economically. It hurts our news report. It makes us less credible in the long run, but it is also particularly true of dropouts. Because the idea, look, yes, it's great if you have a college education, but to have a newsroom with nobody who has had the experience of not going to college, of growing up in a different environment, that's just as valuable in some ways both to the news organization and what's being covered as somebody with a degree. I'm not suggesting that 50% of our newsrooms ought to be staffed by dropouts. We need to be more representative, but it doesn't mean race, women. It also means education. And also, let me say, I also have this great belief in vocational education. And for instance, if I had to look at and really judge what I think Obama's mistakes were, pushing the idea that everybody has to go to college, I think is a huge mistake. There are great jobs. Everybody shouldn't go to college. There are great jobs. There are industrial jobs. There's tech jobs. There's all kinds of things. And some people don't want to go to college. They'll be pushed by your parents, or this social pressure to go to college. I think it's nuts.
You also discovered early on during these experiences the what every reporter eventually learns about the presence of your feelings as a person and how they intrude sometimes onto the job. You were talking about covering the Kennedy's inauguration and just the enchantment of this, spectacle of the president, newly inaugurated president on his way to the White House for the first time. And you're right, it hadn't occurred to me that being a reporter could get so mixed up with feelings. There's a lot of people out there who probably think reporters have no feelings about anything. They just care about the story, but that's certainly not the case.
No, it's not. And also, there seems to me there are two separable questions here. Those two times that I just described, Ike and then the Kennedy inaugural, were the first two times I ever saw President. Although my mother says she took me to Roosevelt's funeral when he went by in the coffin in front of the White House. But to this day, when I go to the White House, I don't know how many times I've been there in 60-something years, quite a few. I get a lump in the tummy. I go in there. You see the pictures on the west wall. And also, I think of the desecration of the place by Trump. We can talk about that. And his lack of regard for the office, as well as this magnificent place where, with all this history that he's not interested in. And, but in terms of feelings, first of all, I think it helps to have strong feelings of all kinds. Anybody, one of the things I got to cover, and also my parents were very involved in I went to school, public school, in the District of Columbia, the capital of the United States. I went to legally segregated public schools till I was in the 6th grade, and the Brown decision came down in 1954. Legally segregated public schools in the capital of the United States. Most people don't realize that we had that in the capital of the United States. And so my parents had been very involved in desegregating public accommodations in Washington. But not just from that, but as I started to cover the civil rights movement, and I don't know that I made up this, what I'm about to say, or if I heard it, I think I heard it from one of the great reporters we had at the Star. And it was covering, I think it was during the Selma, Alabama period. And I used the line in the book that the truth is not neutral. Woodward and I have used this expression for 50 years now about what good reporting is. It's really the best obtainable version of the truth. But that does not mean it's some 50-50 proposition that one side gets 50%, the other side gets the other 50%. I mean, a lynching is not neutral. Pretty hard to find 50-50 covering the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman in Mississippi during the Freedom Rides, which I did, or interviewed the wife of one's in here, of one of them, and they're laying dead under the levee in Mississippi, and think that there's some objective down the middle thing about this. Truth is not neutral. And I think it's something that we in journalism have saddled ourselves with this word objectivity. I think being a reporter is the most subjective of acts. What is it that a news organization, a reporter, an editor really, what's the most important aspect? Determining what is news. And that's subjective. And so this idea that somehow we got to split things down the middle. Suppose there's a bank robbery. Guy goes in with a gun, canvas bag, says to the teller, give me all the money you got, put it in the bag, points the gun, runs out of the place, never heard from him for a month, cops are looking for him, and meanwhile there's a security camera looking at all this. He gets found by the cops. Says, I got an alibi. I've been up here 100 miles away with my cousins up here on the farm. Ask anybody up here, they all know. I think he's arrested. His lawyer says he's innocent, got an alibi. But the DA has the videotapes. You're gonna do that down the middle? You're gonna give 90% of the story to the lawyer saying, oh, no, my client is innocent? No. So we've been saddled with this idea. And it really hurts us that we have this obligation. We have an obligation to be fair. We have an obligation to be judicious, but not to just say, oh yeah, 50%, 50%.
There is a conflict, though. I want to explore this a little more because there is a conflict in journalism now, and I think it's exemplified with a couple of quotes from the book. The first one, the ideal was to get as near to the truth as good reporting could take you, through persistence and listening and observing with an open mind, regardless of your own opinion. So that's on one side. The second thing is came when you were covering the press conference of one of the women who was married to one of the civil rights. Right, who was missing at the time, presumed dead. We now know he was dead. And you write this: there was no way to look at Rita Schwimmer and weigh the facts on the ground in Washington and Mississippi and not feel a personal identification with her and the rightness of what was being fought for at this moment in history. It leaped out at you and transcended the particulars of the scribblings in your notebook. The old 50-50 down the middle, half on one side, half on the other approach was giving way to real reporting that was closer to the truth because, for all the right reasons, as you said, the truth was not neutral. So there's a conflict there. On the one hand, you don't want to impose your own opinion, but on the other hand, you're talking about a situation where what is right is overwhelming and obvious. How do you navigate that? How do journalists today navigate that?
I think, also I've forgotten, I remember the truth is neutral. I forgot the paragraph that went before. I'm really glad I wrote it. And, I don't think it's as hard as it sounds. I think part of being a reporter, there are a few elements about being a reporter, and I get to this question of fairness. One is what's instinctual. And I think reporters do need to have a talent, some kind of native talent that gets developed. I probably had that native talent, but I didn't have a clue how to, develop it until I met these wonderful people who I worked with, who were older than me and became my mentors and teachers. And I think reporters tend to be lousy listeners, that they're so interested so often and they just want to get their story in a paper, get on the air. And political coverage is probably, on television, is probably the most egregious, obvious example I can think of. How many times do you see on the best of the network shows, or cable, the reporter on Capitol Hill say, shove Mike in Mitch McConnell's face and says, well, how about this, Mr. Minority Leader? Shove it in Chuck Schumer's face and says, well, how about this? McConnell says X, Y, and Z. Schumer says, well, McConnell, you don't know what he's talking about. And then the reporter leaves, and he's got all this manufactured controversy that he's ginned up, but he hasn't gone deep into the story. I think it characterizes much too much of our coverage. And that reporters, look, we all have a preconceived notion of what the story is when we go out on it. I have never done a story that turned out to match my preconceived notion. Really. Even if the variance is only that much, but it's never fit into that easy. I thought Watergate, for the first few days, was going to go straight to the CIA. I even wrote a long memo saying why I thought and how smart I was about knowing that this would probably go to CIA. There was no way that the Nixon people would boom, boom, boom. But, open to whatever the information is. So then, at that point, and again, my experience is, remember, our our information in Watergate. Just as what Bob has done on Trump or what I have done on Trump on the air. We didn't get our information from Democrats. We didn't know a damn thing. It all came from people who worked for Richard Nixon. Same with Trump. You think I'm going to learn from Schumer what Trump is up to? Come on. I'm going to talk to Republicans about it. I did a story on CNN and for the website in the last year of the Trump presidency saying that at least 21 Republican members of the Senate held Trump in disdain, contempt, dislike. And I've been wanting to do this story for a long time because I'd heard from so many people on their staffs as well as from some of the senators how much they think Trump is dangerous. And a lot of other things that I put on the air about Trump came from people in the Senate and staff members. And finally I decided, look, I can't sit on this, and I don't have an obligation to the senators because basically of confidentiality, because basically most of my information came from members of their staff. And I said, damn it, I'm going to name them. So I named 21 of them and went into great detail about it. And one I didn't name that counted probably the most was McConnell, who really disdains Trump and has through his whole presidency, except McConnell has been able to use Trump for what McConnell really wants, which is, one, he wants to be the majority leader again, but two, judges. And he's succeeded. 2/3 of the judges are now. So going on with this, I named these 21 senators. One denial, which was a lie, the guy denying it, and one half denial. Next day, I got a call, and think of how craven these senators are. Getting up every day and defending Trump. I mean, part of the reason where we are is because of this. Part of the reason. And so the next day I get a call from a former Republican senator who had left the Senate a couple of years earlier and said, Carl, the number's really closer to 40. It's true.
And McConnell's definitely in that group. So, when you're covering a story like civil rights, like those lynchings, the inhumanity of that is just obvious. I mean, there is just no other side to that. You're killing people based on how they look. It's obviously immoral, and you're right. There isn't two sides on that. Although in the South at the time there were others who probably would have made the argument for it. What about stories where the morality is less obvious? Like take McConnell, for example. President Barack Obama nominates a justice of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Merrick Garland, to be justice of the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell simply announces he's going to ignore that nomination. He's not going to take it up. They're not going to have hearings. They're not even going to meet with the guy. And because we're in a presidential election year, pulled out an old Joe Biden quote that justified his action, notwithstanding the fact that in the closing days of the Trump administration, he made sure that Amy Coney Barrett got elected. But we didn't know at the time. So the Merrick Garland thing, there were arguments on both sides of that. The morality was less clear. Is there a moral dimension to stories like that?
First of all, I think that covering that story is pretty easy because it's not about what the opinion of what you want to find out is. What's the strategy? That's the news. What's the strategy? We found out. I don't think it's about a moral dimension. That's the other thing. It's a huge difference we can talk about this too in our culture today. People can make up their own minds, presumably. You give that example about whether or not what happened with that nomination was right or wrong. I might personally feel it was wrong. And I think one of the great, talk about this too later, I think that probably the great story today, overarching, is the decline of democracy and the pendulum swinging against democracy in this country and around the world. If you look at the number of countries that have moved toward authoritarianism in the last 10 years, the pendulum is really swinging, including, Hungary, Poland, Belarus, parts of Europe, moving much more toward authoritarianism, fascism. Look at the vote for Le Pen's party in France, etc. And look what's going on in this country. So if you're to take that really good example you give of the Garland nomination, what's it really about? It's about the system not working. It's about McConnell and the Republicans taking advantage of all kinds of instruments that traditionally have been based on the merits, judgeship, and traditionally. I mean, you can make an argument that a large part of the antagonistic Washington politics of our time in some ways have to do with the Bork nomination for the Supreme Court, going way back, in which the Democrats kept Judge Bork from becoming a Supreme Court justice. What you need is the information. You need reporters to give you this information. What is McConnell's strategy? Well, obviously McConnell's strategy is to be able to control the Supreme Court. Is that right? Is it wrong? Roosevelt tried to pack the court. You go. But people can make up their own minds. What is so different in the country today from the time of Watergate, when a consensus developed that Richard Nixon was a criminal president and needed to either be impeached and convicted or resign? A consensus developed about that. One of the reasons a consensus developed about it was that courageous Republicans in the House voted for articles of impeachment. Chief Justice of the United States organized the court, Supreme Court, so that there would be a unanimous decision. Nixon would have to give up his tapes. Nixon absolutely thought that Chief Justice Berger would make sure that he didn't have to give up the tapes. Senator Barry Goldwater led a group of senators and leaders of the House to see Nixon 2 days before he resigned. Nixon was really planning to stay in office, fight to the end. Goldwater took these senators down there, and Nixon said to him, Barry, and we do a scene in the final days. We went to see Goldwater, and he had kept a diary of events in the last days of the Nixon presidency. He poured us 2 big tumblers of whiskey, one for himself, and started to read from his diary. So he and these members of Congress went down there, sat across from Nixon. Nixon said, Barry, how many votes do I have for acquittal in the Senate? Fully expecting it would probably be competitive. You need, 1/3 is all you need to survive, as Trump found out and knew. And Goldwater looked at Nixon and said, Mr. President, right now you may have 4 to 6 votes and you don't have mine. 2 days later he decided, or that day he decided to resign. So, compare that to the situation today. Compare the January 6th committee in which the Republicans have totally boycotted it and say it's a partisan witch hunt when it's one of the 3 great investigations, certainly in my lifetime, the McCarthy investigation, the Watergate investigation, by the Senate Watergate Committee, which was created by a 77-0 vote of 77-0. You couldn't get a 77-0 vote for anything in the Senate of the United States. So a consensus developed And early on in the Watergate story or saga, numbers would have been reversed. 40% of people thought Nixon was a criminal president and ought to go. What happened? We saw the evidence. Open to the best obtainable version of the truth. Not senators and congressmen, people generally. The big difference, I think, in the country today is people are looking both sides for information to buttress, underscore, confirm what they already believe, instead of being open to the best obtainable version of the truth. And I think it goes to the heart of part of our failure of our democratic institutions. Because if you have a culture in which people are not open to the truth, no matter how good or well-intentioned those instruments of democracy are, take the Constitution of the United States, which may not work so well these days, and it doesn't, then you're gonna move toward where we are. Go ahead.
So that really points up a question, and that is, you know, in our business, we work very hard to get the facts right, the story right. A lot of people don't see that work. They don't maybe appreciate that work. The worst thing a reporter ever has to do is write a correction for something that they got wrong, and admit that they made a mistake. But all of that work is for naught if you have people who just don't want to hear it. You know, the best obtainable version of the truth, you can present it to them, but if they don't want to hear it, they don't want to accept it, then that is a almost insurmountable problem to perpetuate democracy. You know, the latest knock, and I'm sure you've gotten this, originating I think either with Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity, is to call journalists activists instead of journalists. You're not a journalist, you're an activist.
Carlson is not?
Yeah. Well, and that's the great thing. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. But I'm not saying, of course, Tucker Carlson is the devil, because the devil is a former archangel, and Tucker Carlson is no archangel. But the point is that, and the question is, what do we do to break through that and to get to a point to make people care about that, make people care about the truth, and see that regardless of their personal preferences for a particular party, one over the other, that there are certain things that are right and wrong, there are certain things that we should or should not do in America to perpetuate our democracy. How do you break through that?
We got about 7 questions at once in there, all of them important. And now I am going to take a little time with this answer. I don't know if I'll get to all 7, but they're all interrelated. And you said, goes for naught was your phrase. The reporting goes for naught. First of all, it doesn't go for naught. It's there. The best obtainable version of the truth is there. And good reporters, editors, news organizations keep building on whatever that story is. Secondly, our basic job as reporters, journalists, editors, is to put it out there. What happens with it, how it is digested and put to use, is really not our part of the process. However, part of the process is if we see that information being misused, as it has been in the Trump era, and let's just take the big lie, which 70% of people who identify them as themselves as Republicans now say, oh yeah, the election was stolen. What an astonishing figure. Suppose there's even 60% of people who call themselves Republicans. The election was stolen? Where is the evidence? So our job there is to keep reporting on whatever the evidence is about what took place in the election and what it is that Trump is doing, and people like John Eastman around him, and Chief of Staff and Steve Bannon, whatever. Keep reporting. It does not mean, and here we get to a basic question. I'm giving a lot of thought to this. I think one of the things we have done in journalism and in politics is to look at ourselves, journalists, to look at politicians as if the story is politics, we're journalists, and we're not part of the larger culture. These are cultural questions. They're not political questions. Politics is part of the culture. What's changed in this country? Yes, our politics have changed, but what really lies under the changes? Why is it that so many people have gone along with Trump, including many who know that the big lie is a lie? It's cultural. What is it that animates people who are on one side of the political spectrum and on the other? Culture. And we keep going. And what don't we cover? Pretty much flyover country. What people are saying to each other in the country. So that Trump comes along and we're totally surprised that he gets, forget about 25 or 30% of the vote, that he wins the presidency. We haven't been in touch. And what's the other big story? When I was at the Star, two great reporters who subsequently came to the Post just as I did, Haynes Johnson, who some people here might know about. Incidentally, Haynes and his father, maybe the first father and son to win the Pulitzer. Haynes' father wrote the series for the New York Herald that became On the Waterfront. Haynes gave me my first byline, actually, when he was working as an assistant city editor. He and David Broder, the great political reporter who then came to the Post, starting when they were at the Star, every 4 years during a presidential election, they would go out on the road for 3-4 months, go all over the country and talk to people in their homes. And what they were finding out was very different than either the politicians were saying, a lot of them, or what the conventional journalistic wisdom was. We don't do that enough. But we have had a cultural revolution in this country in the last 40 years. We've had a cold civil war in this country, as I've called it on air, for 40 years. And Trump ignited it. And the forces around Trump ignited it. But it's cultural. And so I think we need to do more reporting and more discussion about, it's not just about Mitch McConnell or Jim Jordan. I mean, how is it that Jim Jordan's constituents don't say, wait a minute, what is this guy up to? They believe in what he's doing. So I think we gotta change the journalistic agenda, and perhaps there'll be politicians as well change the agenda to look at this cultural reality that we have, and also to look, how does that cultural reality fit with the fact that 2/3 of the state legislatures are now controlled by Republicans, most of whom believe in the Trump assertions? We have a different country than we've been writing about or assuming about.
You and Bob Woodward teamed up again this year to write an essay on the differences and comparing and contrasting Trump and Nixon. Let me quote Trump himself for the comparison. He said, "The difference is that Nixon left and I don't leave." And that seems to be one of the key differences. Trump is still out there. You
Also,
covered.
he didn't leave. He refused to leave the presidency.
Yeah.
He is a seditionist, as we write. It's the introduction to the 50th anniversary edition of All the Presidents. Man, 50 years since the Watergate break-in. The book is really only 48 years old, which makes us 2 years younger than.
But you covered Nixon up close. You saw him up close. You've covered Trump. You've seen him, and I know you get asked this question all the time. So I'll ask in a little bit different way. I had the advantage of attending the Los Angeles Times Book Festival that you were present at, in which you said that the battle for democracy, the battle over democracy, is the most important story of our time now. Talk about Trump in the context of that story.
Well, first of all, as we wrote in this new introduction to All the President's Men, Trump is the first seditionist president in our history, if you don't count Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. We've had Joe McCarthy, we've had demagogues, but never a president of the United States. Nixon was a criminal president, and we thought, as we wrote in there, that Nixon sought to undermine the very basis of American democracy, the electoral system, through a massive campaign of political espionage and sabotage, in which the objective was to actually get George McGovern to be the nominee of his weakest possible opponent, Nixon's, to be the nominee in the 1972 presidential election, and knock out the candidacy, strongest candidates that are Edwin Muskie of Maine. And it succeeded, as we wrote in our stories and in the final days. And then, of course, Nixon was a criminal. Illegal wiretappings, break-ins, cover-up, using the IRS to go after his enemies, any number of criminal acts. Trump is something else again. He's a criminal. He's a criminal president. He's a seditionist president. He's been a criminal most of his life. And incidentally, criminal is a pejorative word, yes, but it also does not mean you have to be convicted in court to be a criminal, to use the term. If you can show evidence of criminal behavior, as any of 40 biographies of Trump have over the years, or Trump's own words, he's a criminal. And part of the surprise, if there was a surprise about Nixon, was one secret criminal act after the other. But this whole question of democracy, which I raised earlier about being the greatest, most important story in the world, well, how does Trump fit in there, I think, is really what you were asking. Look, the United States is, first of all, we're the oldest democracy in the world. We're a young country, but the oldest democracy. We're a creaky democracy. Institutions don't work, the Constitution doesn't work in some ways. You can't amend the Constitution because you need 2/3 of the legislature, 2/3 or 3/4, I can't even remember, to approve a constitutional amendment. It'll never happen. The last attempt at a serious constitutional amendment was the Women's Equal Rights Act. It failed. You couldn't get the states to ratify. The Second Amendment, the idea that the Second Amendment says that anybody can carry a concealed weapon. Come on. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson is sitting there saying, oh yeah, anybody can have a long gun and get up in a tower here in Las Vegas and shoot everybody dead. And, come on. Constitution, Supreme Court will tell you, yeah, he can have that gun. So our instruments of democracy, and now you get to what's in that prologue to the new edition, about one thing that relates to January 6th. Demagogues find the soft spot in democracies. Hungary, Poland. You know, they didn't take over in an armed coup. They won at the ballot box. Belarus. They almost won in France. You know, this is not about military coups. This is about using the broken, in some cases, instruments of democracy, including the electoral system. And what craziness at the 21st century, we elect a president of the United States that has nothing to do with the popular vote? That 7, 8, or 9 states really elect the president of the United States and the rest of them don't mean a damn thing? Come on. It's nuts. Yes, it had a purpose 200 years ago, but it doesn't work. So you take Trump, and he understands. This stuff doesn't mean it. I was about to use the F word. Doesn't mean a fucking thing. The Constitution doesn't mean anything. Legislative acts don't mean anything. That's really what Trump has been saying all along and doing. He doesn't give a damn about anything that has to do with anything. And once again, I'm going to quote from the beginning of this book, or of what we wrote. It surprised both of us when we found this. Oops, I got the wrong book. Anybody have all the president's pen on them? No. You got it? Let me take a minute here. It's worth the wait. I promise you. Oh no, I need a new. I'm gonna do it. Yeah, there we go. Back there, the young woman. There we go. This is theater. First paragraph of what we wrote in the 50th anniversary of this book. President George Washington, in his celebrated 1796 farewell address, cautioned that American democracy was fragile. Quote, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, he warned. That's the deal. Two of Washington's successors, Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, demonstrate the shocking genius of our first president's foresight. As reporters, we had studied Nixon and written about him for nearly half a century, during which we believed with great conviction that never again would America have a president who would trample the national interest and succeed in undermining democracy through the audacious pursuit of personal and political self-interest. And then along came Trump. Serious business that reached its apogee January 6th. Talk about the weak spot in the system that the people around Trump realized and then enlarged and manipulated. President of the United States can be elected on only one day every 4 years. January 6th, beginning at 1 p.m. It goes back to a statute, I think it's 1887, I might be off in the year. Not in the Constitution. It was passed saying that the votes of the electors had to be presented to the Congress and then counted, and the president would be elected. If the Congress can't meet, if the Capitol of the United States is overwhelmed by a mob and the Congress has to go into hiding, there's no election. That's what these people understood. this weak spot that they were willing to exploit. Every democracy has these weak spots. And if you have a party or a president or a prime minister who is looking for the weak spot for personal pursuit of power, such as, or instruments or enrichment or whatever, such as George Washington warned about, but Washington is really saying, we can't do anything about that. Unprincipled men and women, I would add now, there are those people who will do that. But presumably in a democracy, with the information flowing to the people, democracy will hold. No. Back to the cultural realities that don't allow democracy to hold right now in our country. End of answer.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I thought I'd end on a more cheery note than that one.
Go for it.
At least I hope the answer to this will be more cheery. You've been in journalism now for decades, in television, in newspapers, magazines. Where do you see the future of the business going in light of everything you just said? What's the future of journalism?
I think we got to talk a little bit about the United States separate, or maybe not. I think the real future, particularly given the economic realities of what's happened in American journalism particularly, but also around the world, and avoid a long discussion and just point to the obvious, that in terms, look, print, we in this country especially, we've lost. The internet has taken that over, which is just fine in terms of, there are great things you can do on the internet you can't do in print. Stories that are infinitely long, as many pictures as you want, you're not limited by space. We all know the downsides of the internet. Social media is another discussion. But I think, the economic model broke. So except for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, maybe some smaller papers a little bit here and there, we have very few great reporting organizations in this country, and we've lost all our local news, basically. And particularly in television, local news is a disaster all over America, always has been. We used to call it lead and bleed. But I think there's more great reporting being done today around the world, perhaps than ever. A lot of it being done by nonprofit organizations. A lot of it being done by consortiums of reporters. Also look at the reporting on the Trump presidency by the White House press corps. Greatest reporting of a presidency, certainly of my lifetime, I think. How do we know so much about Donald Trump? Not just from Woodward, or not just stuff with this reporter or that. And Bob's reporting has been unique about the presidency of the United States for a long time now. We have a history of the presidency, of 10 presidencies, because of Bob's work, starting with Nixon, that we would never have otherwise. But look at the reporting coming from brave reporters all around the world. In Russia, in the former communist East, in Western Europe, in this country. I just came, Woodward and I were just down in Texas for a annual dinner fundraiser for the Texas Tribune. The greatest reporting being done in Texas, and the most important reporting, and everybody there in that state who is in the political system, who is in the leadership, business, and otherwise education of Texas knows it, regardless of their political orientation. The great reporting is being done by the Texas Tribune, not by the Austin Statesman. This is a new economic model that works for a nonprofit. Requires some philanthropy, but here in the United States, we have philanthropy different than the rest of the world. 75 reporters, great reporting, team reporting. It is a model that now I think the Tribune and its former editor are going to try to take to every state. I'm going to see if I can get involved with it a little bit. The potential for nonprofit reporting without being constrained by this economic model that's not working is so great. Look at the Panama Papers, which was developed by ProPublica. Teams of, and ProPublica started with, the first publisher editor was from the Wall Street Journal. Incredible reporting. Look up the story about Pegasus. How many people here know about Pegasus? It is a system developed by some Israelis that can take your cell phone. They're not too interested, people, in your cell phone, but they're interested in law enforcement, terrorists. Terrorists want to use it. People after terrorists, going after terrorists want to use it. It's impregnable, basically. Most cell phone tracking devices, etc., are discoverable at some point. This is absolutely undiscoverable. So that people using the cell phone have no idea that something has been implanted in their phone through this software. And it's being used now by intelligence agencies all over the world. Anyway, look up the reporting on Pegasus by team reporting once again. So I think the future in terms of reporting is much brighter, and particularly in so-called investigative reporting. I think one of the things that in this country, if you look at the Texas Tribune model, and you think, and you can talk a little bit about, one of the things I tried to do today was talk to you and some others to get a better handle on what's going on here I know something about it, but not enough in terms of the two former newspapers and the two principals, Edelson and Greenspan. But y'all are still doing a good job of covering the news. This is exceptional in this country. Think of the number of local newspapers or news organizations that have been lost. They're gone. What was the role of local newspapers? Let's forget about TV news. They're the fabric that held together communities for 100 years in this country or more. High school sports, community meetings, board meetings, neighborhood meetings. Things that if you live in a big city, you might say, oh, that's small bore stuff. Well, most people didn't live in huge cities, and they're still, comparatively speaking, smaller cities, smaller, 1 million people. But they've lost their news organizations. They're not coming back. But this model, I think, will work. But what we may never get back, though, is covering the high school football team. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal. Covering the public library, where they don't burn the books. It's a big deal. We're not going to get that back. So what were these newspapers? They held communities together. They were the public square. That's gone. But we still can get some of it back. So I think this loss is grievous. And that it's not just nostalgia to say that this is a terrible loss. But also we do have something happening simultaneously. I don't think the American presidency is ever going to be underreported? The American presidency has become more powerful and more powerful with each succeeding president. The power of the president has become increasingly there, but so is the scrutiny. So I think there's reason for optimism. I think in terms of pessimism, my own view is democracies are failing. This democracy is failing. And it's not something that I like to hear, and I'm sure it's not something that you like to hear, but I think it's something we really got to look at. And, you know, your question is starting with Tucker Carlson, you know, what can be done? It's cultural. Not sure anything can be done. We'll see. And there's one thing I believe in, and that is that if anything is to be done in this country, it's generational. It's going to take a good deal of time. And I think the one thing that would change us as a country is compulsory national service. For kids when they get out of high school, every kid in America's got to do a year and a half, such as is done in Israel, except in Israel it's the military. Do anything. Work with the Forest Service, work in a hospital. Year and a half. Year. It can be transformative. I was in the Army, not because I wanted to be in the Army, and I didn't want to go to Vietnam, so I was a shirker, basically, nothing I'm proud of. But I made it through basic training, and I later got a medical discharge. But anyway, how many men here, or women, have been in the military? How many of you think it was one of the transformative experiences of your life? That's right. And emotional, too. You don't realize it when it's happening. You're with a group of people totally different than you came from. You got a common goal. You got somebody kicking your ass, saying you got to do this in basic training. There's a common purpose. There's a way of discovering the humanity of people. And you know, I get moved just watching your hands go up. I've never known anybody who had this experience that does not raise their hand about this. General McChrystal is among those leading the effort. Once again, you'll never get it through Congress, at least not now. I'm not sure you could get the Democratic Party to go for it, much less the Republican Party. But I think it's in the long run the greatest hope that I can imagine for the country. It'll take a long time, but I think, you know, you develop this with kids, and already we know how kids, they're different than people of my generation, or the generation of most of the people here. Kids' values, in many ways, are to get along better. Racially, socially, economically. Can't generalize too much, but then people of my generation did. So, but optimistic? Not unless we have some transformation, such as that. And you know, it's often said you can have some great national event and people will pull together. We had the pandemic, didn't. You couldn't ask for more of a model of what should have worked, didn't, became politicized, ideologically riven. But this is also still a country of great people who are, if you look at the people of this country in the aggregate, we're different. And our differences represent great things. But we've got a cultural reality also of those differences have now taken us somewhere in the 21st century. And we haven't even talked about hate. Hate of immigrants. Hate of certain races. Hate of Asians. Hate of black people for various reasons. it's a different phenomenon. We're not talking about something that has been the bane of our history, like segregation. Segregation is a nice term compared to the history of what we're talking about. But what we're talking about now is something different, given that we're a country of immigrants, given that the Civil Rights Revolution has worked in so many ways. So we're talking about a different cultural phenomenon. It's very difficult, I think, certainly for me to accept. I'm going to leave it at that and thank you all for being here.